Montesquieu begins his philosophy with a simple but powerful observation. Human beings do not live in isolation, and because they live together, they create systems of power that shape every part of life. Laws, governments, customs, and institutions are not accidental details placed around existence. They're the very structures through which freedom, order, and justice are either protected or destroyed. To understand human life, one must understand the forces that govern it. He does not begin by imagining an ideal society detached from reality. Instead, he begins by studying the world as it exists, comparing different nations, climates, customs, and political systems. He wants to know why one society becomes stable while another falls into corruption, why one government protects liberty while another turns toward fear and control. His philosophy grows from observation rather than pure abstraction. At the center of this inquiry is the idea that laws must be understood in relation to the conditions of the people who live under them. A law cannot be judged in isolation. It belongs to a larger structure shaped by geography, economy, religion, history, and habits of life. What works in one place may fail in another, not because justice changes, but because human conditions differ. This introduces a more complex way of thinking about political order. Instead of searching for one universal system that fits every society, Montesquieu examines the relationships between institutions and circumstances. Good government is not simply the result of strong rulers or strict laws. It depends on proportion, balance, and an understanding of the society it serves. From here, he turns to the nature of political power itself. Every government, no matter how noble its intentions, contains the possibility of abuse. Power naturally tends to expand. When it is left without limits, it begins to serve itself rather than the people it governs. This tendency is not a rare accident. It is a structural danger built into political life. Because of this, freedom cannot depend on the virtue of rulers alone. It must be protected by the design of institutions. A system must be built in such a way that power restrains power, preventing any single force from becoming absolute. Liberty survives not because leaders are always wise, but because the structure itself makes domination more difficult. This leads to one of his most influential ideas, the separation of powers. Legislative power, executive power, and judicial power should not be concentrated in the same hands. If one person or institution controls lawmaking, enforcement, and judgment, freedom becomes fragile. Fear replaces security because the citizen has no protection against arbitrary authority. When these powers are separated, each limits the others. No branch becomes fully sovereign. This tension creates stability. It may slow decision-making, but it protects liberty by ensuring that no single can dominate the entire political order. For Montesquieu, this is not simply a technical arrangement. It reflects a deeper truth about human nature. Since individuals and institutions are vulnerable to ambition, pride, and self-interest, freedom must be protected through structure rather than trust alone. Political wisdom lies not in assuming perfection, but in designing systems that account for imperfection. At the same time, he distinguishes between different forms of government, not only by their structure, but by the principles that sustain them. A republic depends on virtue, meaning a commitment among citizens to the common good over private interest. A monarchy depends on honor, where social rank and duty create order. Despotism depends on fear, where obedience is maintained through force and uncertainty. These principles matter because institutions cannot survive without the habits that support them. A republic cannot function if citizens care only for themselves. A monarchy collapses if honor loses meaning. A despotic regime becomes increasingly unstable because fear destroys trust and initiative. This connection between political structure and moral life reveals that freedom is not merely a legal condition. It is also cultural. Laws can create space for liberty, but citizens must have the habits necessary to use that liberty responsibly. Without moderation, restraint, and civic awareness, even a well-designed system can decay. Montesquieu therefore sees moderation as one of the highest political virtues. Extremes are dangerous not only in personal behavior, but in institutions. Absolute equality can become destructive if it turns into chaos. Absolute authority becomes tyranny if it removes all limits. Stability comes from balance, from allowing forces to counter one another without destroying the whole. This principle of moderation also shapes his view of punishment and justice. Laws should not be instruments of terror. Excessive punishment may create obedience, but destroys the spirit of liberty. Justice must be proportionate. Punishment should protect society without turning the government itself into a source of fear. At the same time, he is deeply aware of how invisible customs shape public life. People often obey habits more than formal laws. Traditions, manners, and expectations create a second form of government beneath the visible one. A wise political system must understand these forces rather than ignore them. This means that reform cannot simply be imposed from above. Changing laws without understanding customs may produce instability rather than justice. Real political wisdom requires patience, because societies are living structures shaped by long histories, not machines that can be redesigned instantly. Religion also enters this framework, not primarily as theology, but as a social force. It shapes morals, habits, and authority. Montesquieu does not reduce politics to religion, but he recognizes that belief systems influence how societies function. Tolerance becomes essential because attempts to force uniform belief often produce violence rather than order. This tolerance reflects his broader commitment to plurality. Human societies are diverse, and political wisdom lies in managing diversity rather than erasing it. Uniformity imposed by force often weakens the very stability it seeks to protect. As his philosophy develops, it becomes clear that he is not searching for perfection. He is searching for conditions under which liberty can survive in an imperfect world. Freedom is fragile because power is always present, and power always seeks expansion. The task of political philosophy is not to imagine the end of conflict, but to create structures where conflict does not become domination. In this way, Montesquieu moves from the observation of different societies to a profound theory of law, power, and liberty, where justice depends on balance rather than absolutes, where institutions matter more than intentions, and where the protection of freedom requires constant attention to the limits and relationships that hold political life together. As this understanding of power and balance becomes clearer, Montesquieu's philosophy moves deeper into the hidden foundations that make political systems either stable or fragile, because institutions alone do not explain why liberty survives in one place and disappears in another. Beneath laws and constitutions, there are habits, social conditions, and invisible patterns of life that quietly determine whether a government can endure without collapsing into corruption or fear. He becomes especially concerned with the relationship between liberty and security. People often imagine freedom as the absence of restraint, but for Montesquieu, true political liberty is something more precise. It is not the ability to do whatever one wishes, but the confidence that one can live without constant fear of arbitrary power. Freedom exists when a person feels protected by law rather than threatened by it. This distinction is crucial because many governments claim to offer freedom while actually producing insecurity. If laws are unclear, if punishments are unpredictable, or if rulers can act without limits, then citizens may appear obedient, but they are not free. They live under uncertainty, and uncertainty creates fear. Liberty requires predictability, where people know the boundaries of power and trust that those boundaries will be respected. From this perspective, law becomes a shield rather than a weapon. Its purpose is not simply to command behavior, but to create a stable field in which human life can unfold without constant anxiety. Justice is not measured by severity, but by fairness and consistency. This leads Montesquieu to examine criminal law with particular care. He argues that punishment should always be proportionate and restrained. excessive punishment does not strengthen society. It weakens it by teaching citizens to fear the state rather than respect it. A government that rules through terror may appear strong, but it destroys the trust necessary for long-term stability. In despotic systems, fear becomes the principle of order. Obedience is maintained because people are uncertain of what will happen if they resist. But this form of rule carries its own weakness. Fear may silence action, but it also destroys initiative, honesty, and civic life. People withdraw inward, concerned only with survival rather than participation. A free political order requires the opposite. It depends on citizens who are willing to act, to judge, and to participate in public life. This cannot grow under fear. It grows only where there is enough security for individuals to trust both one another and the institutions around them. This is why Montesquieu gives such importance to civic character. Political liberty is not sustained by laws alone, but by the habits of the people. A republic, especially, depends on citizens who are capable of moderation and public responsibility. If private ambition overwhelms concern for the common good, the structure begins to decay from within. Virtue, in this context, does not mean moral perfection. It means the willingness to place collective stability above personal excess. It is a practical form of discipline that allows freedom to survive. Without it, equality turns into competition for dominance, and liberty becomes unstable. At the same time, Montesquieu is careful not to romanticize virtue as if it can be demanded endlessly. He understands that people are shaped by material conditions. Extreme inequality, poverty, or concentrated privilege can make civic virtue difficult to sustain. A society where some have everything and others have almost nothing creates resentment and imbalance that no moral teaching alone can solve. This brings economics into political philosophy. Wealth distribution affects liberty because dependence affects freedom. A person who is formally free but completely dependent on the arbitrary will of another does not experience real security. Political liberty, therefore, requires a certain social balance, where no single group becomes powerful enough to dominate the rest completely. This does not mean perfect equality, but it does mean limits on extremes. Excessive concentration of wealth can distort institutions, just as excessive concentration of political power can. Both create forms of domination that weaken the public good. Montesquieu also turns his attention to commerce, which he sees as a force with both promise and danger. Trade can soften manners, encourage cooperation, and reduce violence by creating mutual dependence between people and nations. Commerce teaches calculation rather than conquest, and this can support peace. Yet commerce can also create new forms of corruption if wealth becomes the only measure of value. A society driven entirely by profit may lose the civic spirit necessary for liberty. Citizens become isolated in private interest, and public responsibility weakens. Once again, moderation is essential. This principle of moderation continues to shape his thought across every domain. Strong government is necessary, but unchecked power becomes tyranny. Economic growth can support stability, but greed destroys balance. Equality is valuable, but absolute leveling can lead to disorder if it destroys the structures that hold society together. Even climate and geography enter his analysis, not as fixed destinies, but as influences on habit and political possibility. Different environments shape different ways of life. Harsh climates may produce certain forms of endurance. Fertile lands may encourage different social patterns. These conditions do not determine justice, but they affect how institutions must be designed. This broad perspective makes his philosophy less rigid than many political theories. He does not believe one constitution can simply be copied everywhere. A wise government must understand the people it governs, their history, customs, and material conditions. Law must fit life rather than force life into an abstract pattern. At the same time, this flexibility does not abandon principle. Liberty, moderation, and restraint remain central. The form may differ, but the danger of unchecked power remains universal. Every political order must answer the same fundamental question. How can authority exist without becoming domination? As this question deepens, Montesquieu shows that the answer lies not in trusting rulers to be good, but in creating conditions where no ruler can easily become absolute. Institutions, habits, economics, and culture must work together to create a balance where freedom is protected not by hope, but by structure. In this way, his philosophy expands beyond constitutional design into a complete vision of political life, where liberty depends on security, justice depends on proportion, and the health of a society is measured not by the strength of its rulers, but by the degree to which ordinary people can live without fear under laws that protect rather than oppress. As this vision of liberty and balance grows more complete, Montesquieu's philosophy begins to move beyond the visible structure of governments and into the deeper rhythm of history itself. Because political systems do not remain fixed. They rise, stabilize, decay, and sometimes collapse. The true challenge is not only how to create a just order, but how to preserve it against the slow forces that erode it from within. He understands that corruption rarely arrives as a sudden event. It often begins quietly, through small shifts in habit, ambition, and expectation. Institutions may remain in place while their spirit weakens. Laws may still exist, but the principles that gave them life begin to fade. A republic can still call itself free while gradually becoming dependent on private interests and concentrated power. This makes political decline especially dangerous because it is often difficult to recognize while it is happening. Citizens become accustomed to small losses of liberty. What once would have been seen as unacceptable becomes normal through repetition. Over time, freedom is not destroyed in a single moment, but worn away through adaptation. Because of this, Montesquieu sees vigilance as essential to political life. Liberty survives only when people remain aware of the forces that threaten it. A free society must cultivate memory, understanding, and a willingness to resist the quiet normalization of imbalance. This vigilance is closely tied to education, not merely formal schooling, but the broader formation of political judgment. Citizens must understand how their institutions function and why limits on power matter. Without this understanding, people may trade liberty for temporary comfort, security, or spectacle, not realizing the long-term cost. At the same time, he recognizes that ambition is one of the strongest forces in political life. Individuals and groups naturally seek influence, wealth, and recognition. This desire cannot simply be eliminated. The question is how it is directed. In a balanced system, ambition is contained and redirected so that it serves stability rather than destruction. This is another reason why the separation of powers is so important. It is not assumed that people will stop seeking power. It accepts ambition as part of human nature and uses structure to prevent it from becoming absolute. Rival forces restrain one another, creating a political equilibrium where self-interest can unintentionally support liberty. This idea reveals something central in Montesquieu's thought. Good government does not depend on perfect virtue. It depends on arrangements that work even when virtue is limited. Systems must be designed for real human beings, not idealized ones. At the same time, he does not abandon the importance of moral life. Structure can restrain excess, but it cannot fully replace character. If corruption becomes too widespread, institutions themselves begin to fail. Officials stop respecting limits, laws are manipulated, and public trust disappears. Once trust collapses, even strong constitutions become fragile. Trust, therefore, becomes an invisible foundation of liberty. Citizens must trust that laws are applied fairly, that institutions are not merely instruments of private power, and that participation in public life has meaning. Without this trust, people withdraw into private survival, and the civic energy of the state weakens. Montesquieu is especially sensitive to the danger of extremes in this context. Political life becomes unstable when any single principle is pushed too far. Excessive equality may turn into envy and disorder if it destroys necessary distinctions. Excessive hierarchy becomes oppression when privilege loses all limits. Excessive nationalism can transform unity into aggression. Excessive luxury can replace civic responsibility with self-indulgence. Moderation, once again, is not weakness but strength. It is the art of preventing principles from becoming destructive by forcing them to exist in relation to one another. A healthy society is not one where a single value dominates, but one where competing values are held in proportion. This principle also shapes international relations. Nations, like individuals, exist within systems of power. States that seek unlimited expansion eventually create resistance and instability. Empire may appear strong, but domination produces fear and conflict that undermine lasting peace. A stable international order requires restraint as much as domestic liberty does. Diplomacy, trade, and mutual recognition are stronger foundations than conquest alone. Power without limit creates enemies faster than it creates security. At the same time, Montesquieu sees commerce as one of the forces that can moderate conflict between nations. When societies depend on exchange, they gain practical reasons to avoid destruction. Trade does not make people morally perfect, but it can create habits of cooperation that reduce the appeal of constant war. Yet even here, he remains cautious. Commerce must remain connected to civic values. If economic gain becomes the only principle of public life, then freedom itself may be reduced to material comfort. A society can become wealthy while losing the moral discipline that sustains its institutions. This balance between prosperity and principle is delicate. Wealth should support stability, not replace virtue. Luxury without restraint weakens public spirit, but poverty without opportunity creates resentment and dependence. Political wisdom lies in managing this tension rather than pretending it can disappear. As his thought deepens, history itself becomes a teacher. The rise and fall of republics, monarchies, and empires reveal recurring patterns. Concentrated power breeds abuse. Fear destroys participation. Corruption grows where limits disappear. Liberty survives where balance is protected and civic life remains active. These patterns do not create destiny, but they offer warnings. Societies are not condemned to repeat failure, but they must learn from it. Political philosophy becomes valuable because it helps people recognize the conditions under which freedom is most likely to endure. In this way, Montesquieu transforms the study of politics into something broader than law or governance alone. It becomes the study of how human beings live together across time, how power shapes character, and how fragile liberty remains when institutions and habits lose their balance. What emerges is a philosophy that treats freedom not as a permanent possession, but as a living condition that must be renewed generation after generation, protected not only by constitutions and rulers, but by memory, moderation, and the constant awareness that power, if left without limits, will always attempt to become more than it should. As this vision reaches its fullest depth, everything begins to come together into a single understanding where law, liberty, power, habit, and history are no longer separate subjects, but parts of one continuous structure. What began as the study of governments becomes a philosophy of human coexistence itself, a reflection on how people can live together without allowing order to become oppression or freedom to collapse into disorder. At this final stage, Montesquieu makes clear that the true problem of politics is not simply choosing between monarchy, republic, or any other formal system. The deeper question is how to create conditions in which power remains limited and human dignity remains protected. Names of governments matter less than the balance within them. This changes the meaning of liberty. Freedom is not a permanent state granted once by a constitution or a ruler. It is a condition that exists only while institutions, habits, and public character continue to support it. Liberty is fragile because it depends on restraint, and restraint is always under pressure from ambition, fear, and the desire for control. Because of this, no political victory is final. A society may establish wise laws and balanced institutions, yet still lose them if vigilance disappears. Citizens who stop paying attention to power gradually allow power to reorganize itself around convenience, privilege, or fear. Freedom fades not because it is openly rejected, but because it is treated as something that no longer needs protection. This is why moderation remains at the center of his philosophy until the end. Moderation is not compromise for its own sake. It is the recognition that extremes destroy the very goods they claim to defend. Authority without limit becomes tyranny. Equality without structure becomes instability. Wealth without civic duty becomes corruption. Security without liberty becomes obedience without dignity. Moderation protects the whole by preventing any single force from becoming absolute. It allows competing principles to remain in tension without destroying one another. This tension is not a flaw in political life. It is its necessary condition. At the same time, Montesquieu's thought reaches beyond formal politics into the moral imagination of society. People do not live only under laws. They live within customs, expectations, manners, and shared assumptions about what is normal and acceptable. These invisible structures often shape behavior more deeply than written constitutions. This means that freedom must be cultural as well as legal. A people accustomed to obedience may struggle to use liberty wisely. A people trained only in private ambition may neglect the public good. Institutions can create opportunities for freedom, but character determines whether those opportunities are sustained. This creates a profound connection between education and politics. To preserve liberty, societies must form citizens who understand limits, responsibility, and public life. Without this formation, even strong institutions become vulnerable to manipulation. The decline of civic judgment opens the door to concentrated power. At the same time, he refuses the fantasy of perfection. Human beings will always carry ambition, fear, pride, and self-interest. A just society does not eliminate these forces. It arranges them so they cannot easily dominate the whole. Political wisdom lies not in expecting ideal people, but in building structures that survive ordinary human weakness. This realism gives his philosophy lasting strength. He does not promise a final harmony where conflict disappears. Conflict is permanent because interests differ and power always exists. The goal is not to remove conflict, but to keep it from becoming domination. In this sense, balance is not peace in the passive sense. It is an active equilibrium where institutions, laws, and citizens continually restrain excess. Stability is achieved not through stillness, but through movement held within limits. History confirms this lesson. Empires rise with confidence and fall through excess. Republics decline when private desire overcomes public virtue. Monarchies weaken when honor becomes empty privilege. Despotisms consume themselves because fear eventually destroys trust. These are not accidents, but recurring consequences of imbalance. Yet history also shows that decline is not inevitable if societies remain capable of reflection. Political life can be corrected when people recognize danger early enough. Reform is possible because institutions are human creations, not fixed laws of nature. What has been made can be remade. This belief in correction gives his philosophy a quiet hope. He does not promise perfection, but he refuses fatalism. Freedom is difficult, but not impossible. Justice is fragile, but not unreachable. Political order can improve when people understand the principles that sustain it. There is also a broader lesson about humility. No nation, ruler, or constitution should assume itself beyond corruption. Power always carries temptation. Stability always contains the possibility of decay. Awareness of this vulnerability is not pessimism. It is the beginning of wisdom. In this state of understanding, political philosophy becomes less about ideal systems and more about disciplined attention. One must ask constantly where power is gathering, where fear is replacing trust, where inequality is turning into domination, and where habits are weakening the spirit of liberty. The purpose of law, then, is not simply command. It is protection. The purpose of government is not grandeur. It is balance. The purpose of freedom is not unlimited desire. It is the ability to live securely, responsibly, and without the shadow of arbitrary power. In the end, Montesquieu presents a vision in which the health of a society depends not on the brilliance of its rulers, but on the strength of its limits, where liberty survives through restraint, justice through proportion, and political wisdom through the constant refusal to let any force become so powerful that it forgets the humanity it was meant to serve. Montesquieu was born in 1689 in France, into a world shaped by kings, rigid hierarchies, and the quiet weight of unquestioned authority. Europe was still dominated by monarchies that concentrated power in the hands of a few, and in France, the image of the absolute ruler stood almost beyond challenge. Law often served power more than justice, and social order was built on inherited privilege rather than equality. It was a world where questioning the structure of authority was not simply intellectual, it was dangerous. Born Charles Louis II, Baron de la Brede, et de Montesquieu, he inherited both status and responsibility. He came from a noble family and was educated within the institutions of law and governance, eventually becoming a magistrate in Bordeaux. This position gave him something many philosophers never had: direct experience inside the machinery of power. He did not study government from a distance. He watched how laws were applied, how institutions protected themselves, and how authority shaped everyday life. This practical exposure would define his philosophy. He was not interested in ideal systems built only in imagination. He wanted to understand how real societies function, why they fail, and what conditions make liberty possible or impossible. From early on, he showed a habit of looking beneath appearances. A government could call itself just while operating through fear. A legal system could claim fairness while protecting inequality. For him, the name of a system mattered less than the structure beneath it. This way of thinking became central to his work. One of his earliest famous writings, Persian Letters, used an unusual method. Instead of directly criticizing French society, he imagined two Persian travelers observing Europe from the outside. Through their eyes, ordinary customs suddenly looked strange. Religion, politics, class, and social habits were exposed not through attack, but through distance. This technique allowed him to do something powerful. He made the familiar unfamiliar. When people are too close to a system, they stop questioning it. By shifting perspective, he forced readers to see their own society as if for the first time. But it was in his later work, The Spirit of Laws, that his philosophy reached its full force. He asked a question that seems simple, but changes everything. Why do different societies create different laws? Most people assumed laws should simply reflect universal moral truths. But Montesquieu argued that laws cannot be understood in isolation. They are shaped by climate, geography, economy, religion, customs, history, and the structure of power itself. This did not mean morality was irrelevant. It meant that political systems had to be understood as living realities, not abstract ideals. A law that works in one society may fail completely in another because the conditions are different. This made his political thought far more complex than simple theories of good and bad government. He was interested in relationships, how institutions interact, how power moves, and how systems create behavior. At the center of this analysis was one of his most influential ideas. Power must be limited by power. He believed that the greatest threat to liberty was not chaos, but concentrated authority. When too much power exists in one place, abuse becomes almost inevitable. Even good intentions cannot protect against the corruption that unchecked authority creates. This led him to his most famous principle, the separation of powers. Instead of allowing one ruler or one institution to control everything, political power should be divided. Legislative power should make laws. Executive power should enforce them. Judicial power should interpret them. These powers should remain separate, able to check and restrain one another. This was not simply administrative design. It was a defense of freedom. Liberty does not survive because rulers are good. It survives because no one is allowed enough power to become dangerous. This idea would later shape constitutions across the world, especially in the United States. But for Montesquieu, it came from observing a basic truth about human nature. People with power tend to expand it. The problem is not only bad rulers. It is the structure itself. A system must be designed with the expectation that ambition exists. At the same time, he did not believe all societies should be identical. Different forms of government could function under different conditions. Republics depended on civic virtue. Monarchies relied on honor and structured ranks. Despotisms operated through fear. His goal was not to force one universal model, but to understand what principles sustain each system and what causes them to collapse. This realism gave his philosophy unusual depth. He was not dreaming of perfection. He was studying fragility, how freedom disappears, how laws become tools of domination, how institutions slowly stop serving the people they were meant to protect. By the time his early ideas had taken full shape, Montesquieu had already changed political philosophy in a profound way. He shifted attention away from rulers alone and toward systems. He asked not whether a king was good, but whether the structure made tyranny possible. And in doing so, he left behind a warning that remains deeply modern. Freedom is rarely destroyed all at once. It disappears slowly when power stops being questioned, when institutions stop balancing one another, and when people begin to mistake stability for liberty. That warning would define everything that followed in his philosophy. As his thought continued to develop, Montesquieu became increasingly focused on a question that most political thinkers before him had approached too simply. What actually allows freedom to survive? Not in theory, not in speeches, but in the real structure of everyday political life. He understood that liberty is often spoken about as if it were a natural condition, something people either possess or lose through obvious oppression. But to him, liberty was far more fragile and far more complex. It did not depend only on the absence of tyranny. It depended on the careful design of institutions that prevented tyranny from becoming normal. This is where his philosophy moves beyond criticism and into architecture. He did not trust political virtue alone. He did not believe freedom could survive simply because leaders promised justice or because citizens hoped for fairness. Human beings, in his view, were too vulnerable to ambition, fear, pride, and self-interest for that kind of trust to be enough. A system had to be built with this reality in mind. This is why the separation of powers becomes more than a famous principle. It becomes a practical response to human nature itself. If one institution controls law, force, and judgment at the same time, abuse is not just possible, it becomes likely. Power does not remain still. It seeks expansion. A ruler who can make laws will eventually want to enforce them without resistance. A judge who answers to political power will stop protecting justice and begin protecting authority. A legislature without limits can become as dangerous as a king. For Montesquieu, freedom exists only where these powers remain divided, watching and limiting one another. This creates a political structure based not on trust, but on tension. And that tension is not a flaw. It is the protection. A stable free society is not one where power flows smoothly without resistance. It is one where resistance is built into the system itself. Friction becomes necessary. Delay becomes protection. Conflict between institutions becomes a sign of health, not weakness. This was a radical way of thinking because many rulers saw unity of power as strength. He saw it as danger. At the same time, he looked closely at different forms of government and tried to understand what emotional forces sustain them. Republics, he argued, depend on virtue. Not virtue in a religious sense, but in the civic sense, the willingness of citizens to place public good above personal ambition. Without this, Republics decay into corruption because shared responsibility disappears. Monarchies depend on honor. Their structure relies on rank, status, and social expectations that regulate behavior. People obey not only through law, but through the desire to maintain position and recognition. Despotisms, however, depend on fear. This distinction was crucial. A despotic state does not need virtue or honor. It survives by making fear the organizing principle of life. Obedience is produced not through loyalty or trust, but through the constant threat of punishment. For Montesquieu, this was the most dangerous form of government because fear destroys the possibility of true civic life. People stop acting as citizens and begin acting only as survivors. This analysis gave him a powerful way of examining political systems. Instead of asking what a government claims to be, he asked what emotion keeps it functioning. That question often reveals more truth than official laws ever could. At the same time, he became deeply interested in the role of law itself. He did not see law as a fixed set of moral commands descending equally onto every society. Laws had to be understood within context. Climate, geography, trade, religion, and social customs all shaped how laws functioned. A law that created balance in one nation might create instability in another. This made him reject simple, universal formulas. He was suspicious of anyone who believed one perfect system could be applied everywhere. This did not mean he abandoned principles. It meant principles had to meet reality. Political wisdom, in his view, was not the ability to impose abstract ideals blindly, but the ability to understand how institutions interact with the actual lives of people. He also paid close attention to economic life. Commerce, he believed, could soften human behavior in ways politics alone could not. Trade created interdependence. It forced people to cooperate beyond tribal loyalty or inherited hostility. Where commerce grows, he argued, there's often less appetite for constant war because stability becomes valuable. This idea added another layer to his thought. Freedom was not protected only by constitutions. It was also shaped by habits, incentives, and the ordinary structure of social life. A society cannot preserve liberty if its economic system rewards only domination and dependency. At the same time, he remained aware that institutions alone could not save a society that had already accepted servitude in spirit. Laws matter, but so do habits of thought. If people become comfortable with obedience, if they begin to prefer security over responsibility, liberty weakens long before formal tyranny arrives. This is one of his deepest warnings. Despotism often begins quietly, not with dramatic violence, but with the slow normalization of concentrated power. Citizens stop expecting accountability. Institutions stop resisting. Fear becomes ordinary, and because the change is gradual, people mistake adaptation for peace. By this stage, his philosophy had become something larger than a theory of government. It was a study of political decay, how freedom is preserved, how it erodes, how societies slowly train themselves to accept what once would have been intolerable. And beneath all of it remained the same central truth. Power does not restrain itself. If liberty is to survive, it must be protected by structures stronger than good intentions, and by citizens willing to understand that freedom is not maintained by comfort, but by constant vigilance against the quiet expansion of unchecked authority. As his political philosophy continued to mature, Montesquieu became even more concerned with the hidden ways power changes people long before open tyranny appears. He understood that oppression rarely begins with chains or public violence. More often, it begins in habits, in expectations, and in the slow reshaping of what people are willing to tolerate. This is where his thought moves beyond institutions alone and into the psychology of society itself. A free society does not survive only because its laws are written well. It survives because people still think like free people. Once citizens begin to accept dependence as normal, once they stop questioning authority, the written protections of liberty begin to weaken from the inside. This made him deeply suspicious of political passivity. He believed that when people become too comfortable, too detached from public life, they create the perfect conditions for concentrated power to grow unnoticed. Tyranny does not always arrive by force. Sometimes it arrives because people are tired, distracted, or willing to trade responsibility for convenience. This insight gives his philosophy a deeply modern quality. He saw that freedom demands effort. It requires participation, attention, and a willingness to endure inconvenience. A system of checks and balances only works if people care enough to defend it. Institutions alone cannot protect liberty if the public spirit behind them disappears. At the same time, he reflected on the danger of political extremes. A society that values liberty can still destroy itself if it mistakes freedom for the absence of all limits. Disorder can produce the same hunger for authoritarian control as oppression itself. This is why he was not interested in absolute freedom without structure. He believed liberty exists within law, not outside it. True freedom, in his view, is not the ability to do anything one desires. It is the security of living under laws that protect against arbitrary power. It means not being subject to the personal will of another person. This distinction is crucial. A person living under unstable chaos may have moments of uncontrolled action, but they are not free because they remain vulnerable to fear and uncertainty. Real liberty requires predictability, fairness, and institutions strong enough to prevent domination. At the same time, he continued to examine monarchy with more complexity than many later readers expected. He did not automatically reject monarchy as a form of government. His concern was never simply whether power belonged to a king, but whether that power was limited by law and by other institutions. A monarchy with strong legal boundaries could preserve more liberty than a republic corrupted by faction and instability. Again, structure mattered more than labels. This refusal to think in simple categories made his philosophy stronger. He was not interested in slogans. He wanted to understand how systems actually behaved. He also paid close attention to the role of social class and inherited privilege. Aristocracy could protect liberty by creating competing centers of influence that limited the crown. But it could also become a tool of oppression when privilege existed only to preserve itself. This balance was delicate. Intermediate powers, institutions between the ruler and the people, were necessary to prevent absolute authority. But if those institutions stopped serving justice and became self-protective, they could become part of the problem. This reveals another important principle in his thought. Every protection against tyranny can itself become dangerous if it stops being accountable. There is no final structure that permanently solves the problem of power. Every institution must itself be watched. At the same time, he became increasingly aware of how religion interacts with political life. Religion could provide moral discipline and social stability, but when fused too completely with political authority, it could also strengthen despotism by making obedience appear sacred. He was careful here, understanding both the importance and the danger of religious power. His concern was always the same. Any force that becomes unquestionable threatens liberty. This applies whether the source is political, social, or spiritual. He also reflected on the influence of education. A society teaches its future long before laws are challenged. If children grow up learning obedience without judgment, fear without reflection, then the habits of despotism are planted before political oppression even becomes visible. Education, therefore, was not neutral. It shaped the moral foundation of government itself. A republic without civic education would not remain a republic for long. At the same time, he understood that corruption rarely feels like corruption while it's happening. People adapt gradually. They explain away each small loss of freedom because no single moment seems large enough to resist. This is why he feared slow decline more than sudden collapse. Sudden tyranny can be recognized. Slow surrender often feels like normal life. By this stage, Montesquieu's philosophy had become a complete anatomy of political survival. He was not describing perfect governments. He was studying the conditions under which imperfect human beings might still preserve liberty. The answer was never simple. It required divided power, strong institutions, active citizens, moral habits, and constant suspicion of any authority that claimed too much certainty or too much control. And beneath all of this remained his most enduring warning. Freedom is not lost because people choose slavery openly. It is lost because they stop noticing the difference. When obedience becomes comfortable, when fear becomes ordinary, and when power no longer expects resistance, liberty does not disappear dramatically. It fades quietly until one day people realize they are living inside the very system they once believed could never happen to them. As his life moved toward its final years, Montesquieu's philosophy became less about identifying the ideal government and more about understanding the permanent fragility of freedom itself. He had spent years studying monarchies, republics, despotisms, and the invisible habits that sustain or destroy them. What he reached in the end was not a simple model to copy, but a deeper recognition that liberty is never a natural state. It is always something temporary, something maintained only through constant resistance against the natural tendency of power to expand. He understood that political systems often fail not because they were badly designed at the beginning, but because people slowly forget why those designs mattered. Institutions created to restrain authority become ceremonial. Laws written to protect citizens become tools to manage them. The language of liberty remains, but the substance begins to disappear. This is one of his most important lessons. A society can preserve the appearance of freedom long after freedom itself has weakened. Courts may still exist, but no longer protect justice. Legislatures may still meet, but only to approve what power has already decided. Citizens may still speak, but only within limits that no longer challenge authority. The danger is not always obvious oppression. Often it is the comfort of believing everything is still normal. This is why Montesquieu never treated political vigilance as optional. He believed liberty survives only where people understand how easily it can be lost. Freedom requires memory. A people that forgets the purpose of its institutions will eventually surrender them without realizing what is happening. At the same time, he became even more convinced that moderation was essential to political life. Extremes create instability, and instability creates fear. Fear then invites the promise of absolute control. This is how societies often move toward despotism while believing they are moving toward safety. People exhausted by conflict begin to prefer certainty over freedom. They stop asking whether authority is limited and start asking only whether it feels strong enough to restore order. For Montesquieu, this was one of the most dangerous moments in political life. Because once fear becomes the organizing principle, liberty becomes difficult to defend. People willingly hand over power they would once have resisted. He saw this not as a failure of intelligence, but as a predictable human response. Fear narrows judgment. It makes control feel like protection. This is why institutions matter so deeply. They must be strong enough to survive moments when public courage becomes weak. At the same time, he never believed laws alone were enough. A constitution cannot save a society that no longer values freedom. Written protections are only as strong as the habits and moral expectations that support them. This is where civic virtue returns as a final necessity. Citizens must care not only about private comfort, but about the public conditions that make private life possible. If politics becomes something people see as distant or irrelevant, power naturally concentrates in fewer hands. Liberty depends on participation, not spectatorship. He also remained aware that equality itself could become complicated. People demand equality because privilege without accountability creates resentment and injustice. But equality pursued without structure can become destructive if it turns into the rejection of all authority. Again, balance was everything. Too much hierarchy creates oppression. Too much instability creates the hunger for authoritarian rescue. The task of political life is not perfection, but balance between forces that constantly threaten to become excessive. This realism is what makes his philosophy endure. He does not offer utopia. He offers warning. He asks people to study not only how governments are formed, but how they decay. Not only how freedom is won, but how it quietly disappears through habit, fear, and indifference. By the time of his death in 1755, his influence had already begun to spread far beyond France. His ideas on separated powers and constitutional restraint would shape revolutions, constitutions, and modern democratic thought across the world. But what remains most powerful is not simply the design of institutions. It is the principle beneath them, that no person should ever be trusted with unlimited authority. Not because people are always evil, but because power itself changes behavior. Even good intentions become dangerous when no resistance exists. This principle remains larger than any one government. It applies wherever authority gathers, whether in kings, assemblies, courts, or even public opinion itself. Unchecked power always moves in the same direction, toward itself. In the end, Montesquieu leaves behind not a promise, but a responsibility. To understand that freedom is not protected by hope alone. It survives through structure, through limits, through citizens willing to remain alert when comfort invites sleep. Because tyranny rarely announces itself at the door. It enters quietly, through small permissions, through accepted fears, through the belief that this one exception does not matter. And by the time people notice the walls have closed around them, the habits of obedience already feel normal. That was his final warning. Liberty is not lost in one moment. It disappears one tolerated step at a time.